Ka pai.
Okay, all right. Ka pai. I'm just gonna get started with a karakia. Okay. Whaia ki te uru tapunui o tāne te waiora, tāne te pukenga, tāne te wānanga, tāne te whakaputa nei ki te whaiao, ki te ao mārama. Tū te ngana, tū ka maranga, te tuhi te rārama, tēnei au e noho matāra nei, e rongo whakairiha ake ki runga, a whakamaua ki a tīna.
Tīna.
Haumi e, hui e.
Tai ki e.
Pēnei ka mihi atu ki a koe tākuta Rawiri, mō tō wā, anō nei ki te whakautu i ngā pātai a ngā whānau. Anō nei ka mihi atu ki a koe Ash, mō tō tautoko, mō tēnei kaupapa, anō nei ki a koutou e mātaki mai ana, tēnei ka mihi atu ki a koutou. No reira, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Matua, to do to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Ka wai te iwi o torohi. Ko wai te iwi o torohi.
Well, kei murupara ahau, ko Ngāti Manawa te iwi.
Oh, Ngāti Manawa, ai ka pa. Mā tātou waka? Mā tātou me te aroa?
Ai, ki taku nei mōhio.
Okay. Tuatahi tēnā koutou, mā tātua waka, mā tātua tangata, te iwi whānui, roto i Ngāti Manawa. Aho ko no whea koutou, tēnā ka pakamihi ia koutou no te hāpori. Ko ai au e mihi atu, ko te ramoro o te manga, ko Whirinaki te awa, ko te hokianga nui a kupe, te moana tapu, ko ngā toki mata whaorua, te māmari me mā tātua ngā waka, ko nuku tāwhiti, rua anui me miru ngā tangata, ngā rangatira o rongo i o waka, ko ngā puinui tonu te iwi, ko rāhiri te tangata, ko Ngāti Korokoro, Ngāti Pākau, te hikatu me te māhurihuri ngā hapu, ko tāna papatara, me te rere o māku, ngā wāhi tapu a whānau. Hoi anō ko tā mātou ki he pūrere kore tai ki te whate. Ko wai au he mihi atu, ko Rawiri Taonui. Kaore ahau he tā kuta tā kuta o tō rongoa, e kore tai e au te whakapai i te kirikiri rongo i tō kiri. So basically, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm an academic doctor. I came into I'm a COVID analyst now, I suppose, and I came into this role because I noticed that when COVID took off, the information that the government was producing didn't really tell the Māori story or provide adequate information for Māori communities in terms of their response. So I just picked that up. I'm semi-retired. I was formerly a professor of Māori and Indigenous Studies. I was New Zealand's first professor of Indigenous Studies in 1910, and I was formerly the head of Māori Studies at Massey University and the University of Canterbury. I retired early, 3 years ago, to do my own thing, and as I said, I'm an independent researcher now. So the majority of my research on COVID, I've self-funded out of my retirement savings. Māori TV and Wātea News have paid me for writing articles and that, but that doesn't really cover all the research, which has been thousands of hours essentially. But I'm you know, so my background is in is in what you might call forensic research. If you give me a problem in that, then I can work out where things originally came from, even if that means going back into a couple of 100 years of history or something like that. And when I was a young undergraduate. I also did stats and calculus, and even today, I still use the the first calculator I ever bought when I first went to university, which is a 1981 Casio T300, and it's the first ever powered solar powered calculator Casio produced, and it still goes really good. So, but it's what, 40-50 years old now, so yeah, but it works good. So that's it. If I just start really briefly, I just wanted to summarize a couple of things. One is the history of Māori vaccination, and also the mRNA vaccine. So when Pākehā came to Aotearoa, they brought with them diseases from overseas, and those diseases had a devastating impact on our people. So Pākehā historians tend to minimize the impact of those diseases, and what they like to do is overemphasize the savagery of the musket wars, and they combine the two to explain our population decline as being our own fault. The reality is that the introduced diseases from the 1770s to say around about 900 probably halved our population. So our population at contact was probably higher than they allow, and it had halved by then. And one of the key things in there is that rongoa wasn't so good at dealing with the foreign diseases, because rongoa was designed to deal with the things we encountered in Aotearoa, and not things like smallpox, diphtheria, typhus, and all the venereal disease and all those really vicious things the Pākehā brought over. In the 1900s, we would have started developing immunity, but the problem at that time was because of the land wars and because of the taking of Māori land, Māori were deeply impoverished. So typically we were living on smaller and smaller pieces of land, smaller and smaller pieces of increasingly marginalized land, because the Pākehā not only took the land, but they took the best land. And that meant we went from having no immunity at all to becoming immunocompromised. And one fact that always sticks in my mind is that in the Uruwetas, between 1924 and 1948, 50% of all Māori aged under 30 died of a sickness or a disease. So if you look around your whanau, your brothers and sisters and all their kids at any hui you're at, and just think from this day forward, over the next 20 years, half of everyone in that age group is going to be gone. Now, because we suffered so much, when one of the worst diseases was smallpox. So in Europe during the 1700s, smallpox killed over 500,000 people. And when it came here, it had several smallpox epidemics had a devastating impact on our communities. So the first ever vaccine introduced was the smallpox vaccine. And because of the devastation Māori had seen in their communities, Māori quickly took it up. And by the mid-1850s, 67% of Māori were vaccinated against smallpox. Now, it's very likely that more Māori were vaccinated against smallpox than Pākehā. And later on, when the benefits of the vaccine were appreciated by Pākehā, then they began to monopolise it for themselves. And then going up into the 1900s, a couple of things happened. One is Pākehā had monopolised the vaccine for themselves. And then the second thing that happened is Māori looked at Pākehā with increasing mistrust because of the Pākehā wars against Māori. I mean, they call them the New Zealand wars, but I call them the Pākehā wars against Māori for taking the land, which seems to be more historically accurate, I would think. But Māori started mistrusting Pākehā and the government, and they also started mistrusting the vaccine. And just after 1900, one of the convergences that occurred is that Pākehā anti-vaxxers, they began to make inroads into the Māori community. So those two things combined. And what it meant is that by 1910, the Māori vaccination rate against smallpox was very, very low. And then in 1913, there was a major smallpox outbreak started by a Pākehā missionary. He came to New Zealand and he attended a hui of Māori in Auckland. And when everyone went home, they took the smallpox back to their whanau. Now, the official figure is that there were only 55 deaths, but there was no medical aid provided for Māori, and Māori villages were locked down. So in the Waikato, they actually surrounded them with armed guards. The government produced 750,000 vaccines and mostly gave them to Pākehā. On the east, and whatever they had left over, they gave to Māori. So on the east coast, they had about 200 or 300 vaccines for more than 2,000 Māori. The Kingitanga settlement at Taupiri of 300 people, and they had a serious outbreak. They were given 80, and in the Hokianga where I'm from, they got none. And there was you weren't allowed to go into town to buy food, and you get chased away with people with guns and things like that. And one Hamilton City councillor, when they had a meeting about should they help the Māori, he said, no, just let them starve, and let them starve to death. So that's one of the things. So the other big issue at the moment, there's obviously a lot of debate about the vaccine. So the Pfizer vaccine is what's called a messenger RNA vaccine. So messenger RNA is everyone has it. Basically, for instance, if you get injured or whatever, your body sends messenger RNA to that area of your body and tells you to repair it. And then once the cells start doing their job, the messenger RNA basically just dissolves away. And so the messenger RNA vaccines, there's two, Pfizer and Moderna. They've been researched for about 50 years, and they've been in development for the last 10 to 20 years. And one of the reasons they were able to develop those really fast is because of the emergency of COVID. A lot more resourcing and finance was provided, so anything they needed to develop them was given. But the second reason is that in 2002, 2003, there was what's called the SARS epidemic. Now, SARS is the ancestor of coronavirus. In the sense that it comes from the same kind of source and has got the same basic sort of structure in that. And but it was less infectious than Delta and COVID, but it was more lethal. So about 10% of people who got infected died. Now, during the development of the mRNA vaccines, in 2012, 2013, they actually designed a vaccination against SARS, just in case there was another outbreak. But SARS, because it was lethal, it basically killed the population it could affect. And because it wasn't very infectious, if they sort of put people in isolation in that, it couldn't spread. So we actually beat SARS hands down. Now, the thing is, when COVID came along, and they were looking to design something against it, they were basically able to go to the SARS vaccine that already designed and say, how would this work against the early strains of COVID? And they're able to make a couple of adjustments and develop a vaccine quite quickly. A lot of people say it wasn't tested properly, but the Pfizer vaccine was tested against 44,000 people. And went through the right procedures for trials, and all the research was checked by a large number of other experts, and so it came through. One of the big advantages of the mRNA vaccine is that it can be designed specifically to attack a vulnerable site on a virus. So if we compare this, for instance, if you have a friend or a relation that maybe gets prostate cancer or breast cancer, and they have to go through chemotherapy. Now, as much as possible, those chemicals are designed to attack particular characteristics of the cancer. But of course, they have, because they're a bit like hitting the cancer with a sledgehammer. It also has an impact on your wider body, like people lose their hair and things like that. So my first partner died of breast cancer and had been through all those things as well. So there's a more general impact. With the mRNA vaccine, what you can do is look at the genetic makeup of the virus and design something that will specifically attack the virus, but won't attack the rest of your body or organs and things like that. And that's what makes them they're the latest generation. And so far the two mRNA vaccines have probably been the best vaccines against all the different COVID strains. They were designed against the early strains, and they will vary according to different variants. And we do see that with Pfizer and Delta. But overall, those have been consistently the two best performers, and we've bought Pfizer. So, Korti tēnā, and do you want to ask those questions, because it'll seem like more natural, and I'll pretend I'm surprised, and then I'll give you quick answers as quick as we go.
Yep, cool. Ngā mihi mō tērā, kōrero, thank you for that. I'm gonna hand it over to Ashley. She's just gonna quickly introduce herself, and then go through the pātai, and we're gonna take turns.
Thank you, Terina, and thank you, Dr. Rawiri. Tēnā rā tātou katoa to all our viewers out there. Kia ora, my name is Ashley, he urio no Ngāpuhi me Ngāti Wai, mō te tai tukirua hau, Inaine. Thank you for inviting me to this space. And yes, Terina has done some research and asked our whanau for their pātai, and I'm just going to start straight from the top. So our teachers out there who are refusing to get vaccinated, what is this going to mean for our schooling? Like, are our tamariki going to miss out? Are they going to have no teachers? How are we going to go about that? Any ideas?
There's going to be disruption, and eventually the education system is going to have to appoint new teachers. Okay. At the end of the day, I support mandatory vaccination. I've got kids at school and they need to be protected. Wow. I would go back to my earlier point. A lot of the anti-vax movement is probably being fueled by mistrust of the government. And then that in turn is being fueled by a lot of white Pākehā driven anti-vax stuff, a lot of which is made up.
Okay. All right then. Right, I'll pass it back to you, Terina. Thank you.
Okay. Tēnā koutou. For those of you who may not know who I am, ko Terina Pupatāhau, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Kahu no Te Rarawa, engari hoki no Ngāti Waiahau, no Ngāti Hine, no Ngāti Whātua ki o Rākei, anō nei no Ngāti Maniapoto no Tūhoi hoki ahau. Now, I'm just going to get straight into the next pātai. And I suppose this question is aimed at our tamariki who are under the age of 12. Why do we need parent consent for the vaccine?
So we need parental consent for vaccinating anyone under 18 because legally they're not considered to be an adult. And that is the same for when our children go through vaccination for other diseases. So that's just pretty much par for the course. That's how the rules operate.
Okay, thank you for that. Another one for our teachers. Well, I guess this goes to all workplaces actually, but do we have the right to know who is vaccinated in our schools, in our premises where we're operating from?
Probably not, because that could be seen as a breach of the Privacy Act. But what will happen in the public sector is that the people who employ you will know, and under the new rules for teachers and health workers, they'll be required to take the appropriate action.
Cool. Okay.
Now, so I'm just going to read this one out. Effects on unborn baby is a lot of our local hapu mama are worried. And what about breastfeeding?
Okay, so if generally speaking, if you're pregnant, there's not going to be a detrimental impact with being vaccinated, and there's also emerging evidence that the baby can acquire, your unborn baby can acquire antibodies through the placenta, so when they're born, they're protected against Delta. If you are having a difficult pregnancy, of course, or got any questions like that, you need to ask your doctor. But generally speaking, the vaccination, you can take the vaccination if you're pregnant, and there should not be problems. Got concerns, though, talk to your doctor.
Yeah, fair. Okay. All right. So the Pfizer vaccine, is this the only vaccine that's being used and promoted in New Zealand, or is there different strains of this vaccine that is being used in Aotearoa?
Yeah, so we originally made agreements to purchase 4 different vaccines, but every vaccine requires a different kind of rollout. So some need to be refrigerated at, say, 10 to 20 degrees. Minus 10 to 20 degrees, and Pfizer needs to be kept at a much lower temperature. So what the government did at the end of the day was assess what was likely the best vaccine and decided to just buy that one, just use that one, so that we would have a more simple rollout. Now, it just so happens that Pfizer on 2 doses is probably the leading vaccination in the world. The other mRNA vaccine, Moderna, is starting to run into some problems with, say, blood clotting, but that hasn't happened with Pfizer. So just to say that with a double vaccination, Pfizer in New Zealand is providing 94.9% protection against getting sick. And in terms of going to hospital, it's providing 98.7% protection, and that's really high.
That's pretty low.
That's pretty good.
Can I just ask one more partai on
Sure.
Just leading on from that? Community, is that the brand name of Pfizer?
Yes. So it's like different brands of cornflakes. Some of them are called Kellogg's, and some are called Sanitarium. It's just the brand name.
Okay, so they're not 2 different vaccines.
No, they're not. No,
Pfizer is just a brand name. Well, Community is just the.
Pfizer is the company. Community is the commercial name, and it actually has got an official documented number attached to its name, and I just can't remember what it is. I just refer to it as the Pfizer vaccine. It was made by 2 companies, Pfizer and another one called BioNTech, one American, one German company. So if, for instance, if you have anyone who's going through breast cancer treatment, prostate cancer treatment, then it's highly likely that they'll already be taking Pfizer medications. So they're and there's been a new one that was approved. I don't know if you remember, but a couple of years ago there were some protests about women in New Zealand not having access to medicines that would fight breast cancer. You know, there was a big movement protest at Parliament that one of the main drugs they were protesting about and wanted access to was one made by Pfizer. So it's one of the best drugs against breast cancer, but it's very, very expensive. And what they were saying is that wasn't being fed to New Zealand women because other women in other countries overseas were able to get it. And that was approved, I think, about 2 years ago.
Okay, kia ora. Thank you.
All right, so our next partai, can you explain the process if you get a positive COVID case? How are our hospitals helping our people who have been affected badly by Delta? So treatments, antibiotics.
He's like, I didn't see that on the notes.
I know, I think you've run 2 questions together. No, that's cool. So the thing is if you're suspected to be a case, you have to be tested, and then if that's confirmed, you have to isolate. Now, up till a couple of days ago, that meant, well, up to a couple of weeks ago, that meant you would go into managed quarantine. So the hotels that we have, some are quarantine facilities where all the positive cases goes. Others are people who come into the country mainly, and they're called isolation hotels. So it looks like the quarantine is full. So people have been going to isolation hotels, but it also looks like they're becoming full. And so just in the last 2 days, it's been said that people who test positive will be asked to isolate at home. The downside of that is if you isolate at home and you are positive, with the highly infectious nature of Delta, there's a very, very high chance that everyone in your household will get sick. So far during the pandemic or the current outbreak, if you're asked to isolate at home and you turn out to be positive, everyone in your whanau ends up with Delta.
No.
Okay. Now,
So,
Aramai, you go, Ash.
Yes.
okay, so
You can have a follow-up question. Yep.
Yeah, so just on that partai, there is, I did ask a question down there. If I don't want to get my at this stage, if I don't want to get my whanau infected, we've really got no option because there's no more facilities left. Is that right? That's just saying if I get infected.
Yes. So, you know, last year when we had the first wave, at any one time we were maybe looking at there being 300, maybe 400 active cases nationally, so they could all fit into hotel or isolation facilities and things like that. As we're talking here today, there are now over 1,300 active cases.
Okay.
And that's a lot higher than could be quarantined.
Yeah.
So now, you know, there are people who are in isolation hotels, which actually are not designed as quarantine facilities, and now that it's went over 1,300 active cases today, and we are heading towards having maybe 2,000 or more cases active all at the same time.
Oh gosh.
People are being asked to isolate at home, so you have to really get prepared for how you manage your home to try and protect people. And of course, if you've got young children and things like that, it's even worse. You may not have seen, but there was an example of a boarding house in Auckland where 4 people were being tested to see if they were positive, and everyone in the boarding house had to stay in place and isolate. And one guy, because he didn't want to catch Delta, and Delta's known to end up affecting everyone in the household, he went outside and lived in a tent and was using a bucket for a toilet to try and protect himself from getting Delta. Now, what you can imagine is if we start ending up with more than 2,000 active cases all at the same time, then that's going to be really hard to manage, and people really need to think about basically at the end of the day getting vaccinated so you don't catch it.
Yeah.
If so, for example, if you know, if the cases, I suppose, if they carried on growing and growing, you know, is this just showing that our health system, you know, our hospitals, our public hospitals, our staff, and everyone who's, you know, in that line of mahi, does that just show how, I suppose, our health system can't actually handle that amount of pressure, and we need to improve our health systems?
Yes, so last year when the COVID first arrived in New Zealand, they did an assessment of the health system, for instance, how many ICU beds and things like that we have and what we could do to increase capacity. I'm not certain yet, but I was talking to someone about it the other day. I'm not sure that was followed through, because at the end of the day, with the first wave, we didn't have like huge hospitalizations. The second thing is I don't think, as we went through the first wave, no one ever imagined, you know, like we also introduced isolation facilities and things like that around June. No one ever imagined we would have this scale of an event. So we had 1,500 cases over about 4 months during the first wave. But as we're talking here today, we have 1,300 active cases just today, all at the same time. And that's a whole different scale. So at the moment, hospitalizations, while they have like tripled in the last few weeks, the health system's still holding. We have just over 40 people in hospital and 5 in ICU. But as the cases build, and more of those cases are unvaccinated people, there's a real risk that the health system will be overrun. I think most people are expecting that, most experts are expecting that to happen.
That's a scary thought, especially for, you know, up here in Te Tai Tokiro, when our hospitals are very small and our whanau are rural. I guess that's best that they could isolate out in the ngahere. But
yes,
that's scary.
Well, a lot of the provincial centres, so I can't cite specific cases. I do know what the capacity was on the East Coast and in Whanganui, but a lot of those provincial hospitals have a capacity in ICU of maybe less than 10 beds. Some are even less than 5. So if there are major outbreaks in those regions, then that's going to be a real concern. Of course, the other side to that is Māori cases are rising really rapidly. So on October the 11th, there were 388 Māori cases. So that's just a bit over 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So 2 weeks and about 2 or 3 days now. Today, there are over 960 Māori cases.
What?
And Māori cases are rising really rapidly. So Māori, you know how they announced 74 cases today and this day and that day. Māori have had the highest number of cases for 25 days in a row now. And, you know, you will have heard, you know, because of that really big cluster in South Auckland early on in the outbreak, there were lots of Pacific numbers. And there are a total of just over 1,100 Pacific cases now. So within the next 6 to 7 days, because Māori cases are rising so rapidly, we will go past Pacific people in 6 or 7 days, and we'll be the most affected ethnicity. And then we're also the lowest vaccinated ethnicity. So there's the potential for things to not be very good for Māori in say 2 weeks or so.
Yeah. Can I partai on from that? As you say that, you know, it's our numbers are rising. Okay, so we're going to get COVID. Is it really that bad? Is getting COVID going to kill me?
Well, so in May of this year, so for every 40 cases, Māori cases there was 1 death. Now we've got a lot more cases happening now. So far there have only been 2 deaths in the Delta outbreak. One of those was Māori and one was Pacifica. We have over, as we're talking here now, there are 560 active Māori cases, so nearly half of all the active cases. We do have a world-class health system and they provide a high level of care. But as the health system is required to look after more and more cases, then we're likely to see that the number of people who die per 100 will begin to increase.
Right, okay.
And if that is the case, the increase is going to be mainly among Māori.
And are our COVID cases that go into hospital prioritized over our other health patients? Like, does that affect, say, cancer treatment, someone getting cancer treatment? Is that going to take away a bed from them if you're in there with COVID?
Well, it depends on the numbers and whether or not they require, what level of care they require. Okay. So the more people you need to look after in ICU, because they're at risk of losing their life, then obviously the less able the health system is to look after other people. So what you start to see is that like outpatient care and operations and things like that, they all end up being delayed. And that's, one reason where when people are saying, I'm making, it's my right to choose not to take the vaccine, that's fine. But on the other hand, that can be a very selfish decision. And one of the reasons I would say that is because at the moment, I can just give you the number here. I was just looking at it before, is 80% of people going into hospital at the moment are unvaccinated. And so they take up beds, and they can take up ICU, and that means the more we have, the less the health system's able to do other things.
Kia ora.
Ka pai.
Okay, now where were we?
We're up to number 7, I think.
Yeah, for those of our whanau, and we've probably already gone over this.
No, this is a good question.
For those of our whanau who have underlying health conditions like diabetes, heart disease, or cancer, what are the risks involved in getting the vaccination?
So generally speaking, the more underlying health conditions you have, the more important it is for you to get vaccinated. So obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, all those things weaken your immune system. And COVID sees that and becomes a happy little virus because he knows they're going to have a really warm feed on you. And the more of those conditions you have, the higher the risk of you getting really sick and dying are. So it's absolutely important to get vaccinated. Now there are 2 risks. There are several risks, like if you, I don't know if you're vaccinated, but if you get vaccinated, you get a really sore arm. I found vaccination really terrifying because I don't really like needles, and I get things like that. But a lot of people have minor reactions. You might get, no one in my family did, but you might get a headache and things like that. There are 2 main risks to getting the vaccine. So one is called anaphylaxis, but what that essentially means in common language is if you've got a history of allergic reactions like hay fever or eczema or those sorts of things, then it's really important to talk to your doctor, or when you go to the vaccination centre or place, or tell them. Now what they can do is manage the way they vaccinate you. They're still going to jab it into your arm, but they can be prepared in case there's a reaction, and then they can manage that. So One of my friends has got a history of anaphylaxis, so allergic reactions. So they took her into a room on her own, and they had a couple extra people in there just to monitor that she was okay, and she was okay. The second one is what's called myocarditis, and that is a reaction where you get an inflammation of the heart. Now, the Ministry of Health website says that occurs about 1 in a million vaccinations, but I think it's actually a bit higher. I think it's maybe like in the 4 or 5 per million vaccinations, and it tends to affect young men more than any other part of the population. So any young men who say father or whatever has had a heart condition, or they've had a heart condition like that, it's really important that you tell the people vaccinating you so that they can also manage that. Now just to sort of balance that up with how important the vaccination is the inflammation. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart, typically caused by a virus. Now, the thing is if you get COVID, there are about 40 in 1 million cases, mainly young men, that get myocarditis. There are about 4 per million who get myocarditis if they're vaccinated. So I did have an exchange on Facebook recently where a young Māori man wrote to me and said that he actually had a history of myocarditis and should he get vaccinated? And I said, the first thing you need to do is go and talk to your doctor and tell them. And then about a week or so later, I wrote to him and said, how did you get on? And he said, I didn't have $20 to go and see the doctor. And he mustn't have been to see the doctor for a while because it's quite a bit more than $20 these days. He said he went and got vaccinated anyway and he's been fine. So I sort of, yeah, but the other 2 main risks, anaphylaxis, or what sometimes people call it anaphylactic shock, but it's an allergic reaction, and the myocarditis, are the 2 most serious.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay. I'm going to ask the next question. What happens if you only get the first vaccine? Because some whanau aren't going back to get the second vaccine. So how effective is just one vaccine going to be?
So one of the things with Pfizer, so all the vaccines were designed to deal with the earliest strains of COVID. And since then, there was actually the emergence of a strain in June last year, which became the dominant world strain, and it was different. And then we've had Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. They came towards the end of last year. And what's happened, we've been using the same vaccine, but now against different mutating viruses or variants. Generally, they've still been effective. Some of the vaccines against, like the South African variant, for instance, they became almost useless. One of those was AstraZeneca. Now we've got a new vaccine strain. Now it just turns out that actually the AstraZeneca that was useless against the South African variant is actually doing quite good against Delta. And then the other one that's Pfizer is probably the best. It does have a weakness though on 1 dose. So roughly on the figures in New Zealand so far, Pfizer gives you 80% protection against getting sick and 80% protection against being hospitalized. But that's a lot lower than what I was saying in terms of the 97-98% protection against sickness and being hospitalized. So at the moment, if you have one dose, you're 4 times more likely to get sick than a person who's double vaccinated, and you're 15 times more likely to be hospitalized. So 2.
Double vax, okay. Kia
Double
ora.
vax, yeah.
Okay, next part. A booster is made up of the same ingredients as the vaccination. What's in the boosters?
Well, generally, if you get a booster shot, you're also going to get a lollipop, and that's about the only difference. So what's happened is that in some cases, so what's mainly happened worldwide is in people that have things like diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, heart disease and those sorts of things, the vaccine's been really helpful in terms of not getting sick, not going to hospital. But what has been reported is that the vaccine is waning in those people after, say, 3-6 months, something like that. So there's debate about whether that happens with everyone or it just happens with immunocompromised people. So at the moment, the main approach is, and I think New Zealand's just picked this up, is that anyone with those sorts of conditions and who have a compromised immune system, after a certain period, you can get a booster. Now, in New Zealand, it's going to be the same Pfizer shot, and it will just pump up your resistance again. Overseas, some people are thinking about, say, if you had Pfizer, they might give you a booster shot that's one of the other better performing vaccinations, for instance, like Moderna or AstraZeneca. We haven't gone there yet.
Thank you. So after we get all our vaccines, are we going to eventually build a natural immunity to this disease without vaccination? Or is that generations ahead in our mokopuna, hopefully?
So the best answer to that is we had the first couple of waves of COVID go around the planet. And one of the expectations was, and a lot of countries actually said they wanted to adopt this as a strategy, and that is a lot of people would get sick, most of them would recover, but they would become immune. And so they'll be protected against being infected again. Now, in what happened is in a place called Whanau, which is the largest city in the Amazon, they had a really, they got inundated with COVID, and there were a lot of deaths. So like something like 70 or 80% of the city ended up being infected. It's really poor, low health care, lots of indigenous people and things like that. But they thought the upside of it was at the end of that episode was that they would have acquired immunity. Now, they probably did against the strains that infected them. But then we had that generation of like the British variant emerge in England, the South African variant emerge, and then we this is towards the end of last year, and then we had what's called the Brazilian variant emerge called P1. And what happened is P1, a mutation of viruses in Brazil, appeared, and it swept through Manaus again and began infecting huge numbers of people who had already recovered from COVID. So the rate at which COVID can mutate probably means that if you acquire immunity, it may only be against the version you had. And if there are new variants, then there's the risk of you being infected. Now, the variants all have different qualities in that way. And so far, Delta is showing itself to be able to infect people who have previously recovered from COVID. So long term, what we're looking at is, we probably need another vaccine to sort of cover alpha, beta, gamma, and delta more thoroughly. But we also need to be aware that there's every risk of there being new versions of COVID, and particularly Delta. Actually, internationally, there are now over 45 recognised subtypes of Delta, which are being monitored by health authorities around the world. And in Britain, one of those subtypes, it's called Delta AY 4.2, has just been elevated to what they call a vaccine of interest. So internationally, Delta is what's called a vaccine of concern, along with Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, because they're the four really serious ones, and we know that they cause a lot of harm. At another level, there's what's called vaccines of interest. They're the ones health authorities are worried might become dangerous. And so Delta AY 4.2 has just been elevated to that status in Britain. Not everywhere else, but just in Britain. And that's because just in the last few days, AY 4.2 has become 10% of cases in Britain. And I don't want to scare anyone, but we've had 30 cases of AY 4.2 in New Zealand.
Don't see that on the news.
No, you don't.
Why not? Why are we not seeing it on the news?
Well, I don't know, but I'm on what's called the GSED index, which is the sort of main research portal for the World Health Organization. Okay. So I go and check these things out there all the time. Okay. And yeah, so that's one. So it's not a vaccine of concern right now, but at least one country has said, listen, you know, see, the thing is Delta's super infectious. It's the dominant virus. It's pushed everything else away. But if a new subtype comes along and in a period of a few weeks or a month goes from 0 to 10% against Delta, then that could be serious. We don't know yet. It could be it was more infectious, but not so dangerous. We don't know. But Britain has elevated it to a vaccine of interest. Yeah, and the key message is there will be new strains, and we'll probably end up needing yearly vaccinations. Can I just add that one of the reasons this is going to happen is because the World Health Organization had a plan to vaccinate the whole planet at the same time. And if we all steadily built up, we'd kind of squeeze COVID into one corner and then be able to wipe it out. But what happened is all the rich countries decided to buy all the vaccines they possibly could for their own populations. And what's that left is an uneven world where at the moment, a lot of the rich countries, which we are part of, are sitting on 60 to 80% fully vaccinated. And a lot of the poor countries are less than 2% vaccinated because they can't get vaccines and they don't have the money and all those sorts of things. And what that's allowing to happen is it's creating pools of unvaccinated people where the virus can mutate.
Wow.
So eventually, even the rich country approach, eventually it'll come back to bite you because new variants will go back around the world. And of course, the rich countries always want to reopen as soon as possible and go traveling. And the more you move around, the more likely you just help all that stuff happen. But that's the key thing driving it. One of the key things driving it. And yeah.
So pretty much we can expect variants of COVID to come about and potentially more and more vaccines to ensure our immunity against the virus.
We probably need ongoing vaccination. It's a bit like the flu. The flu.
The flu shot. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it mutates just enough for the vaccines never to be able to catch up. And so what happens is every year they make a register of all the new ones and they try and predict what else might happen. And then they make the best vaccine they can and you take it and it's pretty good. But sometimes you still get the flu. So we're probably heading there with the COVID-19 vaccination.
Okay,
kia ora, thank you.
Yes, no worries. Number 10, I think.
Where were we, whanau? I think we're at what's the efficacy of Pfizer against Delta? will I die if I get COVID whilst vaccinated or unvaccinated?
I think he's pretty much covered that one. Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
So double vaccinations is giving very high protection. So my early estimates of reading all the international literature was that, and I was saying to some of my friends, I think that Pfizer is actually a bit weak on the first dose. And but I did think it was maybe 85 to 90% on the second. But it's really clear in New Zealand that we're getting well over 90%, and I think that's really awesome. But basically, if you're unvaccinated, you're 15 times more likely to get sick. You're 60 times more likely to go to hospital. And if you're Māori, we already know that you're about 2.5 times more likely to die. And that could actually be slightly higher if with something like Delta, because the research hasn't been done there yet.
So,
Okay.
aroha mai. Just following on from that. So why is it that it's more Māori getting, sick, or more Māori getting Delta? Why, is it because we're most of us are unvaccinated? Yeah.
So the thing is that we've suffered in every epidemic event to come to New Zealand in the very early times because we had no immunity. And then in the, say, between 1900 and 1950, or in the early 1900s, because we became immunocompromised through poverty and living on, small pieces of marginalised land. Now, the historical legacy of that is that Māori have more comorbidities, more diabetes, more heart disease, more kidney disease, more cancer and those sorts of things. Because we are generally poorer than Pākehā, we also live in more crowded housing and things like that. And that's what makes us more vulnerable to COVID. Now, the second thing on top of that is if we remain the lowest vaccinated, then essentially we're becoming even more the most vulnerable to get infected, get sick, and there'll be a higher probability that we'll be the ones to die. Long COVID, number 10.
Yeah, well, I suppose, I guess how is it gonna be that, is there long-term effects from COVID? I have spoken to a couple of people who have had COVID and they're fine.
Yeah, sure. So there is a thing called long COVID. I was raised in quite a, sort of a kind of a poor environment, and we worked hard and we worked early. I was doing cleaning when I was 10 years old to help my whanau out, and I had a job when I was 14 delivering milk in the morning. I used to get up at 3 o'clock and work till 7, and then come home and then go to school at 9 to help my whanau. So, and we used to play in the mud and that, we didn't have like Lego and stuff like that. And so one of the things with long COVID, there is a thing called long COVID, but if people talk about aches and pains and that, well, that doesn't really make a big impression with me. But what we can generally say is that it looks like at the moment, and there's still research on this, that about 20 to 30% of people have ongoing symptoms. So a number of people, particularly, younger people, they might not have many symptoms while they're sick, and they'll recover and they might still be okay and say, well, hey, listen, like I feel okay. So, but there's about 20 or 30% have symptoms, and most of those are the minor symptoms, like aches, they feel tired, they feel nauseous, they feel sick. But there's an emerging picture that, so it's a definite picture. The exact numbers are not sure, but there is a number of symptoms in long COVID, say for about 10% of people, that last maybe 3 to 6 months or even longer. And that they are things that affect brain function, lung function, heart function, kidney and liver. And some of those are quite serious. And one of the reasons those things happen is because as Delta spreads around your body, it's entering different cells and making them produce viruses. And if, for instance, that happens a lot in your lungs, or it can also happen in your other organs, then that can leave lasting damage. So at the moment, some people say that might be 10% of long COVID cases. Most of the research has been done on trying to combat the disease rather than looking at the after effects at the moment. But there is a long COVID syndrome. Most people will be okay. But some people, it's going to be quite serious. And, one of the bottom lines of that, when I look at it, is if you've had impaired brain function, lung function, heart function, liver, kidney function, or a couple of those, then you're probably going to end up living a shorter life.
Kia ora, thank you.
Okay. All right, to our next partai. Where are we? Number 13.
Yep.
If I get infected and I don't want to get my household infected, where can I go and what can I do? And if there are facilities available, do we need to pay for these? Is there any other government support if I'm required to isolate to ensure my whanau are cared for?
Yeah, so I don't know enough about the whanau support things to, other than what's available through WINS, and the wage subsidy and those sorts of things. People like whanau order providers and that would probably be give better advice there. The problem with the situation we're at in the moment is, we're seeing new cases every day, but also there are more people recovering. The problem is the number of active cases at any one time is getting higher and higher and higher all the time. And today it's 1,304. The higher that number becomes, the more difficult it is going to be to accommodate those people in isolation facilities and away from their whanau. And so it's going to be really, really important that if you're planning for risk with an isolating member who might be positive or and ends up being positive, that you're trying to work out a way to deal with that yourself. One of the things is it will be obvious to a lot of people is maybe move other people in your household somewhere else. But of course, the rules state that they're a high risk of being infected anyway, and the rules say you can't really do that. But it is important, if it's at all possible in your living arrangements, to plan. So in our whare, for instance, we've got a bedroom at one end of the house, and it's got an attached toilet and bathroom, and we've got a long corridor. And it's possible for us to maybe plan around that. But again, the risk of everyone in the house becoming infected is very, very high. And if that was a situation I was living in, I'm going to be really, really concerned about my 11-year-old, because at the moment she's not eligible to be vaccinated. I live in Palmerston North, and we've got no cases. We had one not a while ago, and I think Auckland's sending kids back to school and that this week, or they did on the. I've said to my daughter, if there's one case in Palmerston North, even if COVID's only in their little toe, you're just not going to school. Yeah, Delta will go through a family just like that.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. Okay, I'm gonna pick out a question that I want to ask, because
Sure.
It's been going on for a little bit now. But the government wants us to get to a 90% vaccination rate. What's going to happen after we reach 90%? They say we need to be vaccinated by December. you know, like other countries, are they planning to open the borders? Are we just going to be living with COVID as per normal? I don't understand why we need to reach a 90% vaccination rate. What's going to happen after that?
Yeah. So I don't think the government strategy makes sense. What the government said is that no one's beat Delta, but that's actually not true. Taiwan was hit by a very big alpha outbreak in May this year, and it took them about 3-4 months to get on top of that. But along the way, they actually beat 2 Delta outbreaks as well. So that shows it's really possible. Now the Taiwanese vaccination rate was much lower than New Zealand. Now, when Auckland stayed at level 4 for 5 weeks, and then the government made a decision to go to level 3, all COVID experts in New Zealand said that was the wrong decision. And when cases increased, the government made a decision 2 weeks after that to actually open up Auckland a little bit more. You know, the 10 bubbles can meet and have lunch and things like that, but no more than 10 people. But all the kids can go back to preschool, which means the kids can get COVID and spread it through preschool, but the adults can't meet more than 10 people, so that doesn't make sense. And then what they've said is, if the average rate gets to 90%, then they'll ease restrictions and we'll begin living with COVID. Now, the problem with that is that if we look at the eligible population in New Zealand, that leaves about 400,000 or 500,000 people who won't be vaccinated. And it also leaves about 800,000 children under 12 years old who won't be vaccinated. And that is just building a pool for Delta to exploit. And the other problem with the 90% is that's 90% of, say, all people in Auckland, but it doesn't recognise that Māori are a long way behind the 90%. You know, so for instance, if Pākehā get 92% vaccinated and we're sort of 70, it might work out to be 90. And if they open that up, then Māori are going to be vulnerable. So Māori have been subject to a lot of racism because we're slow, our numbers have been slow to catch up. But the main problem with the vaccination rollout was it was designed by age. And when they started at 65, there's 400,000 people, Pākehā people aged over 65. And that basically privileged them. And it discriminated against about 150,000 Māori aged 45 or over 50, whose risk profile is the same as a 65-year-old Pākehā. So what happened is the rollout privileged the white people, but made the brown people who have got as high a risk profile wait. And the other thing with the age bands coming down, it also discriminated against Māori because 51% of our population is aged under 34. And that's the last age group to come online. And that's why we're behind. So, and that's also why it's really important to get vaccinated, because they're not doing us any favors. Jacinda Ardern has said she's not doing a special level for vaccination for Māori. When it hits 90, they're going to green. The other problem with it is, Ash, is the government's following a policy that, now this is really important, is the government's following a policy that was adopted in Britain and the United States and Europe to live with the virus. So get vaccinations up really high and we'll just live with it. Now, so last week, on October the 19th, the World Health Organization reported that the highest number of new cases in the world by country were the United States and Britain, 800,000 new cases. And the region with the highest number of cases in the world, highest number of new cases in the world is Europe, with 1.4 million cases last week. Now that's the rich world with the highest vaccination rates, but the vaccination rate's not high enough. It's about where we are. and we're already starting to open up, so are they, and Delta's just having a field day. Now, the other side of that, of those facts, is that the rest of the world, including all the really poor countries who've got no vaccines, like some countries have not hit 1%, they're maintaining, you know, like the levels and the restrictions, and the Delta's cases are going down. They haven't beat it down to zero, but the thing is the white rich world opening up and adopting sort of traffic light systems, cases are going up, the highest in the world. And in the poor brown places with, you know, hardly any vaccines, Delta is going down. So in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, last week, the weekly total of cases in those continents went, Delta cases went down by between 13 and 18%.
Sorry, Matua, it just sounds like that if you're less vaccinated, the Delta's not going to affect your country as much.
No. Here's the thing, is if you open up, Delta will get to the unvaccinated people. But if you maintain the controls and stop people moving around, then you'll protect them so you can get them vaccinated. So the key thing in Auckland is in that 5 weeks, the Delta cases were going down. Because people went to level, people went moving. And when they went to level 3 and all the essential workers could go to work, and all the people who may be going to sell some things they shouldn't be selling decided to go for a bit of a drive, and you know, a policeman standing there 1 week and there's 2 people drive past, you could think maybe I should stop that one. But the next week it's 500 cars. They got no idea. And that's when Delta started taking off, is because it allowed people to move around. So Delta became a happy virus. Nice border around Auckland and lots of people moving around. You know, it's like going to McD's. Wow, this is really awesome. And at the same time, because people are moving, it disguised where it was going long enough for it to get a real good grip, and it's taken off. And that's what's happening now in Europe, UK, and Britain.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly move on to our next partai. In other countries, everything seems to be operating as normal and COVID has become a normal part of life. Is this, I think we've,
That's what I just answered.
we've probably gone over this.
I don't think I have any more partai. I do reflect on the Spanish influenza, but I mean, you talked about smallpox, so yeah.
If Delta gets really big, a large number of the cases are going to be Māori, and just on all the current numbers, we're going to suffer the most. And in that sense, it's going to be a bit like 1918. So,
okay.
Yeah. The rongoa question's a good one. So I'll ask that. Doctor, do you think rongoa Māori can assist? Answer. Thank you for that question. But the way I like to answer that question is to refer to Te Rangi Hiroa, who was our second ever Māori doctor, and he fought in World War I, and he was a very famous academic as well. And he actually wrote his MA thesis on rongoa Māori and modern medicine. And his approach always is that he thought the best combination was traditional rongoa and vaccination. He thought rongoa worked, but the problem with it is that it wasn't designed to deal with the foreign uruta, foreign diseases, and that's why we needed to vaccinate. So he was a very intelligent person, and when the Tohunga Suppression Act came in 1908, some of the other Māori MPs actually supported it, but he didn't. And he believed there was a place for rongoa Māori, but when it comes to foreign diseases, we need those foreign vaccines.
Great question. Great question, Dr. Rawiri.
Thank you.
I don't have any more partai te rina.
Yeah,
Oh, well,
I
ka
think
pai.
that's us. I think, you know, we've gone over pretty much everything, and you know, we've been on here for more than an hour now.
Mm. Well, was this
And I
one
just wanted
scheduled for an hour and a half or just an hour?
Oh, well, as long as the partai,
Okay.
as long as we covered our partai, I suppose. And yeah, so I don't have
Ka pai
anything
tēnā.
more to add, and I think hopefully our whanau out there who are watching were able to listen in and get their answers. Yeah, so ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Thank you for you know, giving us the time to be able to host this hui. Yeah, nō reira, ka nui te mihi atu ki a koe. Anō nei ki a koe, Ash, thank you for you know, for helping me host this.
I'll just say something to close up. I mean, you know, in the 1900s, after the land wars, you know, we had Māori that didn't trust the government and therefore they didn't trust the vaccines. And they were wound up by a lot of Pākehā who were anti-vax and just anti-government as well. Now, we're seeing something very similar to that today, and particularly in the age groups between 20 and say 40. Yep. And we have very low vaccination rates there. So that is a real concern. You know, I'm not a particular fan of the Pfizer company. I think there's things I've seen them do internationally that I don't particularly like. But the Pfizer vaccine is a vaccine that works against Delta, and it's one of the best ones. Now, it's really important to get vaccinated to protect your whakapapa, to protect your whanau, and to protect our tamariki. And if you don't, you know, there's that 10-20% chance that you're more likely to get sick, a 60% chance you're more likely to end up in hospital, and there will be a greater chance that you're going to die. And basically, some people are going to remember you as the ancestor that didn't make a good decision to protect your whānau and whakapapa, and that's going to be the bottom line. Now, we need to remember that all those people that died in the 1913 smallpox epidemic, Māori who died in 1918 at 9 times the rate. I'll just finish with one story. At Waimamaku, after the 1918 pandemic, a little party were going around to the settlements that didn't receive help, trying to find out how they were. And this one guy wrote a report and he said, when we reached this place in Waimamaku, we found 14 dead people. He said they'd all had the flu, but some of them looked like they died of starvation because no help arrived. Now, he said one of them was a mother and her 4 children, and she had died, and we know the mother, and she lost her husband and 2 children to the 1911 typhoid epidemic. He said the only 2 survivors are her twin 8-year-old daughters. Now, those people suffered like that because they did not have the luxury or the privilege of a vaccine, and we do. And one of the other problems that we suffer sometimes is we forget the suffering that they endured because those people are no longer with us. So we need to make decisions as good mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, and eventually good ancestors, and protect our whakapapa and get vaccinated. Whanau, tēnā kouroa. Thank you very much for having me on. It's you're only very young people, but it's good to see you have the courage and initiative to put something like this up, you know, because there are people out there that might also give you a hard time, eh? So te mihi nui ki a kouroa, tēnā kouroa. Ka pai?
Ngā mihi, I'm just going to close off with a quick karakia and then kua matu te kaupapa.
Kia ora.
Nā reira, tēnā ka mihi atu kia koutou katoa marangai kia ruia e kia nei te papa o huati o huata, o maira toku tau kia hau ariki te kura te winiwini, te kura te wanawana, ki tua reina, ki tua reitai, ki te whakamaunga, ki kina. hikina mai te kikina he manu whakatau ki pai, ko tū ki taha waiho, ko tū ki taha ka panga atu e koe ki ngā kai he tāmina, he tārawa, he tūpā kaurorohi, ki whakaotinuku, ki whakaotirangi. Tō manawa tōku manawa kārihia ki wai onuku, kārihia ki wai orangi, whano mai te Tokyo haimi e hui e.
Pai
Pai.
ki e.
Stay
Thank you,
safe,
Te
Lee.
Rina. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Te Rina.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Hei kona kaurua. Bye.